Hey man, Shane here. There's been some big stuff going on with training volume, and it's made a lot of people quite frustrated, and I understand why. But let's start at the beginning. Your training volume is the number of hard sets you do per muscle per week, which gets a little bit tricky because most exercises stimulate at least a few different muscles at once, and they stimulate different amounts of muscle growth in those different muscles. For example, the bench press is great at stimulating muscle growth in your chest, but it's only about half as good at stimulating muscle growth in your triceps. So to solve that, you could count it as one set for your chest and half a set for your triceps. This fractional way of counting volume tracks pretty well with the amount of overall muscle growth you can expect to get out of an exercise. So let's say you do 4 sets of bench press on Monday and 4 sets of incline bench on Friday. That gives you 8 sets for your chest, but only 4 sets for your triceps. Maybe you also do another 4 sets of overhead pressing, adding another 2 sets, bringing you up to 6. These pressing exercises are pretty good at stimulating the short and medial heads of your triceps, but what we're missing is an exercise for the long head. So, to balance things out, we can add in an overhead tricep extension. Maybe you do 2 sets of those on Monday, bringing your triceps volume up to 8 sets. That should give you balanced growth both between those muscles and also within those muscles. You'll be hitting both your lower and your upper chest, along with all 3 heads of your triceps. Some of the bigger exercises give you a tremendous amount of value. With the deadlift, you're getting a full set for your hamstrings, adductors, glutes, traps, and lower spinal erectors. And then you're getting half sets for half of the other muscles in your body, including your lats, rhomboids, teres major, rotator cuff, rear delts, grip muscles, and 17,000 postural muscles. If this is starting to sound complicated, you don't need to worry about it too much. Most people count the volume for their bigger, more prominent muscles, and then they trust that their compound exercises will take care of the smaller ones, and the deeper ones, like the many layers of core muscles that are packed under their abs and obliques. Where you could start running into problems though, is if you swap out too many of your bigger exercises, like a standing overhead press, for much smaller exercises, like a seated dumbbell press or a lateral raise. If you do too much of that, and you shrink your exercises down too much, you might start missing out on those hundreds of smaller muscles that you aren't counting. But then on the other side of it, you don't need to aim for perfect balance and you don't need to fully develop all of your muscles. So it's perfectly fine if some of them get far more volume than others. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's start with low volume training. There's this idea out there that skinny hardgainers, like me, should follow low volume training programs because we have poor muscle building genetics and we can't recover from very many sets. There are 2 problems with this. First, it's pretty common for naturally skinny guys to have a hard time eating enough food to gain weight. That can stem from our metabolisms, our stomach sizes, appetite signaling, or digestive issues, sometimes all 4 at once. And if we aren't eating enough food to gain weight, then of course we won't build muscle. But following a low volume program won't help with that because the issue has nothing to do with stimulus or recovery. It's a diet issue. We need to find a way to eat more calories and bring in more nutrients. I have a video on that here. Second, there's a completely separate issue, which is called being a low responder. A low responder is someone who doesn't respond very well to the stimulus of lifting weights, which means that when you try to bulk up, you'll gain mostly fat, even if you're bulking slowly and being careful about it. When that happens, it's because there isn't enough stimulus, so what you need to do is add more, and one way to add more stimulus is to do more sets. For example, in this study, they took a bunch of beginners and they had them train one of their legs with 2 sets per week and the other leg with 8 sets. The people with better muscle building genetics grew just fine either way, whether they were doing 2 sets or 8 sets, both of their legs grew. But the people with worse muscle building genetics only gained muscle in the leg that was doing 8 sets. Also, even with the people with better genetics, they grew slightly more muscle when they were doing 8 sets compared to 2. So in either case, doing more volume tends to help. There's another line of research looking at people with different proportions of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. The guys with more fast twitch muscle fibers, the guys built for sprinting and Olympic weightlifting, they can build muscle faster, but they also fatigue faster and they take longer to recover between sets and between workouts. These are the people who do well with fewer sets, and they often do really well with fewer sets. On the other hand, some people have more slow twitch muscle fibers. They have endurance builds. They're built more for marathons and long distance bike races. Their muscles aren't as big and they aren't as explosive, but they also don't fatigue as easily, and they recover much faster between their sets and between their workouts. These are the people that tend to grow better when they do more sets. This can create a confusing situation where the guys who are the biggest and the strongest and who are building muscle the fastest will often swear by shorter, harder workouts. And it can be tempting to follow in their footsteps because it's obviously working so well for them. But unless your genetics are similar to theirs, then it might not work as well for you, and you might benefit from doing more volume. Maybe. Even if you're starting off quite thin, and even if you've struggled to build muscle in the past, I wouldn't assume that you have bad muscle building genetics, or that you're a low responder, that you have a higher proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers. Some of my thinnest clients blow up like nuclear bombs as soon as they learn how to combine a good workout program with a good diet with a good lifestyle. Whether you're skinny or not, you'll probably have a somewhat average response to the stimulus of lifting weights. It will probably take you about 4 sets per muscle per week to make consistent gains, and you'll probably make substantially better gains if you bump that up to 8 sets per week. So, if you want a totally minimalist, low volume approach to weight training, then I do 2 or 3 full body workouts per week, and I do 2 to 4 sets per muscle per workout, giving you a total of 4 to 8 sets per week, with 4 sets for the muscles you care less about and 8 sets for the muscles you care more about. A good low volume routine is enough to get all of the health benefits of lifting weights, and it's usually enough to build a strong and athletic physique. And then once you have that physique, a lower training volume is more than enough to maintain it. However, almost everyone will build muscle even faster if they do more than 8 sets per week. It's just that the extra training volume takes time, and it's tiring, and it isn't quite as efficient. So before you start adding extra sets, it pays to make sure you're lifting properly, pushing hard, writing down how much you're lifting, and then trying to lift more next week. And maybe by the time you pluck all of that low-hanging fruit, you don't need to reach any higher. But let's talk about reaching higher. The research on training volume is strange because what you'd expect to see is a hill-shaped graph like this, right? Where doing more sets stimulates more muscle growth with diminishing returns as you keep adding sets, and then a plateau, and then a point where you run into recovery problems and your results start to get worse. What's weird is that, at the moment, researchers haven't found the point where volume starts to hurt muscle gains. We do see diminishing returns, but we don't see a point where those returns diminish to nothing. And we definitely don't see a point where the results start to get worse. This holds true up to at least 25 sets per muscle per week, and there are a couple of controversial studies that show benefits to reaching even higher, maybe even higher than 40 sets per week. And this seems strange to almost everyone, including the researchers. Kind of. Usually, when you look at people who are the best at something, whether that something is oil painting or gymnastics, these tend to be the people who spend the most time training and practicing and honing their skills. They're obsessive people, and they pursue those obsessions with every ounce of energy they have. Running is a really good example. It's one of the highest impact activities out there, and it has an incredibly high injury rate, way higher than lifting. Runners pound their feet into the pavement with the full weight of their bodies over and over and over again, many thousands of times per workout, sending tremendous amounts of stress through their feet, ankles, shins, knees, and hips. And yet the best marathon runners run for multiple hours per day, accumulating over 100 miles per week. And then they add plyometrics and strength training on top of that. If you look at the best bodybuilders, you often see something fairly similar. Some of these guys are spending hours in the gym every single day, sometimes doing multiple workouts per day. Their tendons develop more connections to their bones become much denser, and their muscles become more resistant to the stress of lifting weights. They adapt to handle the extra training volume. My business partner, Marco, used to train college professional and Olympic athletes, and some of these people were training as their full-time job, with multiple workouts per day. Not all of these workouts were hypertrophy workouts, but they were still recovering from and benefiting from a huge amount of training volume. And then you also hear these infamous stories from Hollywood actors, who are often beginner lifters, who start training for 4 hours per day, 6 days per week, for several months in a row to prepare for a movie.
Do special workout because when you finally turn into Spider-Man, you're muscular as hell. Well, how did that work? How do you get that size?
I worked out for 5 months, 6 days a week, up to 4 hours a day.
And some normal people train quite a lot too. My wife has a friend who does 2 hours of training every day, starting with an hour of cardio and then doing an hour of lifting, just because she likes it. However, these high volume approaches to training also make quite a lot of people quite skeptical, and I get that. One argument you'll hear is that when you're doing these high volume routines, you aren't actually stimulating extra muscle growth, you're just causing extra muscle swelling. The idea is that if you're gaining extra muscle, it should come along with a proportionate amount of extra strength. The problem is that when you look at one of these big meta-analyses, it shows that strength plateaus with fewer sets, whereas muscle growth continues on, with more sets giving you ever more muscle growth. But it's an illusion. Greg Nuckols went through the studies in the latest meta-analysis, and he found that when people gained more muscle, they also gained more strength. It's just that more of the low volume programs were on beginners who gain extra strength by improving their coordination, and more of the high volume programs were on more advanced lifters who have already developed that coordination, slowing their strength gains down. I think a better argument against these higher training volumes is that you get greatly diminishing returns for your time and your effort and your energy. I don't have any aspirations of being a bodybuilder, and I don't want to spend all of my free time lifting weights, so I'd much rather follow a more efficient program that frees up time for more of my other hobbies, like drawing these YouTube thumbnails. The other thing to consider is cardio. Instead of going from lifting 4 hours per week to lifting 8 hours per week, giving you a tiny little bit more muscle growth that you probably wouldn't even notice, instead, you could add 4 hours of cardio, which would be way better for your health, fitness, energy levels, mood, and physical appearance. If you want to spend more time lifting though, then it isn't wrong or stupid to go through a phase of gradually working up to higher training volumes. Maybe as high as 25 sets per muscle, maybe even higher. And if you're clever about it, then you should be able to get slightly better results from all of that extra effort, at least for a while. Once you start butting up against your genetic potential, the people training with a moderate volume might catch up to you. Or maybe they wouldn't catch up to you. Maybe going through a phase of training with higher volume allows you to make adaptations that expand your muscle building potential. Higher volume routines usually use shorter rest periods, more drop sets, and they also mix in higher rep ranges. When you're doing a lot of dense work like that, your body makes vascular adaptations in the areas you're training, allowing you to send more blood and nutrients into the area, potentially allowing you to build greater amounts of muscle there, not just in the moment, but also in the future. There's also a way to get all of those benefits without needing to follow a high volume training program. More on that in a second. I think it's really important to consider the research, but something really interesting happens if we look at some of the more popular workout programs. Greg Nuckols, from Stronger by Science, wrote the most recent review of the volume research, and in his most popular hypertrophy program, he has about 12 sets per muscle per week for the target muscles, with the option of adding extra accessory exercises to bump the volume higher, if you want. On the bodybuilding side of things, Eric Helms is probably the most famous hypertrophy researcher, and he's also a professional natural bodybuilder. His 4-day and 5-day workout programs both have about 12 sets per muscle per week. This is one of those mainstream bodybuilding programs where the volume is spread pretty evenly throughout the body, but then cuts off at the neck. If we go more towards the aesthetic side of things, Jeffrey Verity Schofield's most popular program, Ravage, is a 6-day workout program that has around 12 sets per muscle per week, but now the volume is migrating higher up on the body, with fewer sets for the legs and spinal erectors, and more for the upper body, including a couple of sets for the neck. Natural Hypertrophy's intermediate bodybuilding program is a 5-day routine with 12 sets per muscle per week on average, with the option to bump that up to 16. He's aiming for a slightly different aesthetic. His program goes a little heavier on the arms and neck and upper back, and a little easier on the legs and spinal erectors, and also easier on the chest. Our intermediate hypertrophy program for men, Outlift, has a 3-day, 4-day, and 5-day workout routine with easy and hard versions of each. The most popular of those is the 4-day hard routine, which has about 12 sets per muscle per week. These workouts put even less emphasis on bulking up the legs, but they put more emphasis on the chest and quite a lot more emphasis on the lower and upper spinal erectors, because I think that's a really important part of getting stronger, preventing back pain, building a thicker torso, and improving posture, which is hugely important for everyone and even more important for naturally thinner people. Our women's program inverts that, with a similar number of sets on average, but with the emphasis shifted down to the lower body. All of these programs have about 12 sets per muscle per week on average, just with the volume spread around a little bit differently. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Most of us built these programs by going through a long period of trial and error, both with ourselves and then with hundreds or even thousands of clients. And these workout programs aren't materializing out of thin air either. We're building on top of the wisdom of previous generations of lifters. So I think if you're trying to bulk up and build muscle overall, then it makes sense to do at least 8 sets for your lower priority muscles, and then as many as 16 sets for your higher priority muscles. And if you want, you could exaggerate that spread even further. Once you've built a good base of muscle and strength, it starts to get harder to stimulate more muscle growth, and your workouts also start feeling harder. Deadlifting 4 plates for a set of 6 to 8 reps takes way more out of you than deadlifting 135 pounds for a set of 6 to 8 reps, even if you're leaving the same number of reps in reserve. You need more warm-up sets, you need to summon more energy, and you need longer rest periods. And then when you get to the next exercise, you don't have as much energy for it. At a certain point, it starts getting less fun to bulk up every muscle all at once, which is where specialization routines come in. And you can try these out whenever you want. They work great for more advanced lifters, but you don't need to be advanced to benefit from them. With a specialization program, you take your lower priority muscles and you push them down to a lower training volume, maybe as low as 4 sets per week. That's enough to maintain your gains and maybe even continue to make some slow progress. If you're a guy, probably the squat and deadlift that are getting pushed down the lowest. And maybe that means doing 3 to 4 sets of squats and 3 to 4 sets of Romanian deadlifts every week, and that's it for your legs. That isn't very much, but you aren't skipping leg day and you aren't opening up any weak spots, and there's no downside to your health, so there's no problem. A totally minimalist, low volume program is more than enough to be strong and healthy, and it frees up all this energy that you can invest into the muscles you're the most eager to grow. I started off with 10-inch arms, and they've always been hard to grow, and I hit a really hard plateau at 15 inches. So I tried gradually working up to doing 30 sets for my biceps and another 30 sets for my triceps. That might sound like a lot, but arm exercises are pretty small, and I was supersetting them together, and the rest times were pretty short, and there was barely any leg training, so the program was actually pretty easy overall. I was only training about 3 hours per week, and I felt totally fresh everywhere except for my arms. And after a few months of that, I finally got my arms up to 16 inches. I didn't make any progress anywhere else, but I didn't lose any progress either, which was perfect. What happens is that when you push an area harder, you'll make great gains and you'll get those promising vascular adaptations I mentioned earlier, but your muscles also grow tougher. They grow resistant to the stimulus, and you can accumulate stress in your joints and tendons. So after a few months of focusing on one area, it helps to shift your attention over to a different one. And while you focus on that new area, you'll maintain your gains in your arms, and your elbows will get a chance to fully recover and grow tougher, and your biceps and triceps will regain their sensitivity to the stimulus of lifting weights, which may, some experts think, allow you to get a new wave of muscle growth the next time you specialize on them. You can move through a bunch of different goals like that, and those goals can be aesthetic goals, health goals, strength goals, performance goals. As long as you're building on top of a good low volume base, then all of this extra stuff is a bonus, so you're free to train for the things you want, which should keep lifting fun even as you get years deep. Just because you're specializing though doesn't mean you need to train with a high volume. A big part of specialization is pouring your best effort into your target areas, putting those exercises first in the workout and spreading them out nicely across the week. When I was chasing a 3-plate bench press, I was doing 3 workouts per week, with 4 working sets of bench press as my first exercise on Monday, and then another 4 sets as my first exercise on Friday. After the bench press, I did some overhead pressing and skull crushers. That means I was doing 8 sets per week for my chest, along with maybe 12 or 15 sets for my front delts and triceps, and 3 or 4 sets for everything else. That was enough to carry me all the way to doing 2 plates for 15 reps and 3 plates for 1 rep, which is way more than I thought I would ever be able to lift. If you want to try our beginner program or our intermediate program or any of our specialization programs, I'll link them in the description, including a free one. All of them either come with coaching or they give you the option to add it on. All right, that's it for now. I hope you liked the video. If you have any questions or if you want me to delve into any of the controversies, then drop a comment below. I hope to see you in the next one or the last one.